Have you heard that the IRS is replacing its First Time Penalty Abatement relief program? You may not even be aware of what First Time Penalty Abatement is. But before I'm going to dig into that, I'll dig into that shortly. The good news is the relief itself is not going away. And in fact, it's going to actually get easier. It should at least become easier because the IRS plans to begin applying it automatically. The transition is going to begin during the summer of 2026. We're in the summer of 2026 as I'm recording this, but there's going to be some important limitations and potential problems that you need to understand. I'm Bob Jablonsky. I'm a certified tax resolution specialist. I work nationwide working with taxpayers to solve their IRS problems. So for years, there's been a program, and it's called First Time Penalty Abatement, or FTA. And the reality is you may not even know what it is, but basically what it is if you filed late or you paid late or you deposited late if you have payroll taxes on behalf of employees, but you had a good compliance history for the previous 3 years, the IRS could and typically would remove certain failure to file, failure to pay, and failure to deposit penalties. However, that relief wasn't automatic. Taxpayers generally, first of all, they had to know the program existed and then call or write the IRS to request it. So what's happened now is that what's happened in the past is that many qualified taxpayers never got the relief because they didn't even know to ask. So what's going on now? Well, the IRS is going to replace that first time penalty abatement with a new program called Automatic Exemption from Penalty, or AEP. And under the AEP, when an eligible original return is processed, the IRS system is supposed to review the taxpayer's compliance history automatically. If the taxpayer qualifies, the applicable penalty will not be assessed in the first place. The taxpayer should then receive a letter explaining that the penalty was not assessed because of their prior compliance history. And that's an important difference because under that old system, remember, the IRS assessed the penalty first, they potentially charged interest on it, and then they only removed it after the taxpayer requested relief. However, under the new system, the eligible penalty should never even be assessed. That's actually an improvement, right? The IRS is going to begin, they're planning to begin phasing in AEP during the summer of 2026, and it's going to apply with eligible 2025 annual returns filed after it's phased in, as well as 2026 quarterly returns for payroll tax returns. And that means that eligible returns with due dates on or before January 1st, 2027 will be covered by AEP instead of first time abatement. So when we're making those 2026 income tax filings, they should be covered under AEP. And not all returns are eligible. They're going to include the Form 1040, where we all file our personal income tax return, Form 1065, 1120S, and 1120, as well as some employment tax returns, such as 940 and 941. And there's going to be certain returns that are not eligible. And these generally include information returns and returns that are filed only because of a particular or infrequent event. So who's going to qualify for AEP? And for the annual return, the IRS is generally going to look at the previous 3 years involving the same type of return. So I filed my 1040 return in 2027. They're going to be looking at 23, 24, and 25. And those returns must have been filed timely, and the taxpayer must have paid the tax due on time. Generally, there cannot have been a penalty during that 3 year period other than an estimated tax penalty, unless that earlier penalty was removed for reasonable cause or due to an IRS error. For quarterly returns, such as the Form 941, the IRS generally reviews the previous 12 consecutive quarters, which is 3 years. And the relief can apply to qualifying failure to file when you don't file on time, failure to pay when you don't pay on time, and failure to deposit penalties. And that's when payroll tax is not deposited on time. And that's regardless of the dollar amount. However, it's not going to eliminate the underlying tax. You still owe the tax. It's not an abatement of the tax itself. We're talking about these penalties. and it doesn't abate or eliminate the interest charged on that tax or any penalties that are not eligible for AEP. So what happens to penalties that are outside the new timeline? So this is one of those exceptions, and this is where transition can become very confusing. First time abatement is not disappearing immediately for every tax period. If your penalty relates to an older return that is not covered by AEP, you may still need to request first time penalty abatement manually. And that generally can be done by calling the number on the IRS penalty notice or submitting a written request on Form 843. I suggest you give them a call. If you qualify, you often can get it just resolved right then and there. And even during this transition, the IRS warns that some taxpayers may receive penalty notices for eligible 2025 returns or 2026 quarterly returns because their returns were processed before the new technology was fully available. And then, importantly, keep in mind that new processes often have bugs, and it's possible that a return that qualifies could be missed. We're not going to know until this goes into place whether that happens. The IRS is a huge entity. There's a lot of complexity that goes on there behind the scenes, and we're not really going to know how perfectly or imperfectly this works until it gets rolled out. But if that happens, don't assume that receiving a penalty notice means you were ineligible. Review that 3-year period or the 12-quarter period, compliance history. And if you believe the penalty should not have been assessed, contact the IRS. So what if you don't qualify for AEP? And this is going to be a similar answer if you didn't qualify for first-time penalty abatement. You still may qualify based on reasonable cause. And reasonable cause is different. It doesn't really look at your compliance history directly. I mean, it may be part of the evaluation. But what we're talking about here is there's serious illness, death, natural disaster, or the inability maybe to obtain necessary records or other circumstances that are outside your control that may support a relief. It was beyond your control. And in this case, the facts and the documentation matter. I give this extreme example. My tax returns due on April 15th. I was in a hospital. I was in a coma from April 1st to June 1st. Of course, I could not have filed on time. And it doesn't need to be that extreme, but it needs to have been something that was outside your control. There's also a concern that was brought up by the National Taxpayer Advocate. And suppose you qualify for reasonable cause this year, but the IRS automatically uses AEP instead. If they do that, you could potentially lose your automatic administrative waiver, that AEP waiver, and when reasonable cause should have resolved the current penalty, leaving that waiver available if you make another mistake later. So that's something that we judge as, somebody comes into us. Do we use that first time penalty abatement, or is reasonable cause something that we can use here? And we only use it if reasonable cause fails. This may take away that option is the concern there. And whereas the National Taxpayer Advocate recommended that the IRS allow taxpayers to substitute a reasonable cause relief when that happens, the IRS hasn't really addressed that issue yet. Let's wrap this up. Automatic relief should help many more taxpayers because it's automatic. But never assume the IRS technology worked perfectly. And remember that you can still claim FTA relief for those periods that don't qualify for AEP. If you receive an unexpected penalty notice, confirm the taxpayer, the type of penalty, and your prior compliance history. Look for a separate notice confirming AEP relief. If you believe you qualify but you didn't get it and the penalty was still assessed, contact the IRS and specifically ask whether AEP or first-time abatement would qualify in this case. Automatic relief doesn't mean error-proof, and an IRS penalty notice is something you should never ignore. So I'm Bob Jablonsky. If you have significant IRS debt, unfiled returns, or penalties, and you need professional guidance, we help you with those types of problems. And we can help you determine the most effective way to address your entire problem, not just that one penalty. If you're interested in a free tax strategy session, give us a call, 972-821-1991, or click the link in the video description below to reach out to us.